Hey, welcome everyone to our monthly College of Natural Sciences webinar, the Pilina series. We're really glad to have you here with us today. My name is Alison Sherwood. I'm the Interim Associate Dean for the College of Natural Sciences. And as many of you know, through our webinar series, we're aiming to reach the broader community, people who've been affiliated with the college over the years, or other people who are just interested to see the kind of research that happens in the college and in some of our sister units across the campus. Today's presentation features Dr. Peter Sadowski from the Department of Information and Computer Sciences in the College of Natural Sciences. Dr. Sadowski is an assistant professor of information computer sciences at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He completed his PhD at the University of California, Irvine in 2016, as well as postdoctoral studies also at UC Irvine. Prior to that, he completed his undergraduate at Caltech in 2009. His research focuses on machine learning and applications to the natural sciences. Peter teaches numerous courses in the College of Natural Sciences through ICS at both the undergraduate and the graduate level, and he's also a key member of the University of Hawaii at Manoa Data Science Institute. And so I'm really happy to welcome Peter here today for his talk, How Artificial Intelligence is Accelerating Science. Thank you so much, Peter, for talking with us today.
Thanks, Allison. I'll add the share. All right. So yes, in addition to the Information and Computer Sciences Department and the Hawaii Data Science Institute, I also work with the AI Precision Health Institute, which I run with Dr. John Shepard at the UH Cancer Center. And I also run a research group here at UH Manoa, where my students and I study machine learning and how we can use that to address science problems. So this is a topic that I really like sharing. So it's a very exciting time to be talking about artificial intelligence because a lot of things happened just in the last year. And so I'm going to give a brief overview of what's happening in that space, and then talk about 4 different ways in which AI can be applied to accelerate science. So supervised learning is the type of machine learning that most people are familiar with. And I have a bunch of examples of how we're using that to accelerate science in projects here at UH Manoa. But also some lesser known areas are simulation-based inference, where you combine AI with existing physics models or models from other scientific disciplines. And then we also have these dimensionality reduction and visualization techniques, which are very popular, and active learning, which is where an artificial intelligence agent interacts with the world in a kind of robot style way in order to collect more data and learn more about the world. On the right here, I have a diagram of a brain-computer interface, which was created by one of these AI imaging techniques, which are very new and very fun to play with. And I have more images of that throughout my talk. So the difference between artificial intelligence and machine learning is early AI systems required programmers to specify all possible behaviors. So you could get some system that exhibited intelligent behavior, but you had to have someone program all the details of what that behavior should be. And that's very time consuming. And if you want a very complicated system, you can't just hire tons of programmers to do that for you. So one of the big advancements in artificial intelligence lately is that we're using machine learning to learn how to behave from lots and lots of examples. And now that we have computers everywhere, we're collecting tons of data, and we have a lot of data to train these systems to automate these processes. So you can think of this as an algorithm that learns to program itself from data. And this is called machine learning, which is a subfield of artificial intelligence. And deep learning which is the core technology that really took off in the last 10 years, is a special type of machine learning. And then data science applies these tools to the other scientific disciplines and other applications. And so it kind of overlaps all these areas. So just to introduce some of the big AI advances that happened in the last couple of months. One of them is in the area of chatbots, and chatbots have been around for a long time. There's this famous ELIZA chatbot from the 1960s, where all the responses were programmed by humans, but you had it was a big system, and a lot of programming went into it, and you could get some pretty cool dialogue interacting with the system. But the key limitation was that it's this giant lookup table where every time you type in a sentence, the computer has to look up what the proper response is to that sentence. And if it didn't have something very similar to the sentence you typed in, then it wouldn't know what to do and it would give up. So what happened just a couple months ago is that OpenAI released this ChatGPT model on the internet. So anybody can go and play with this. And you can give it all sorts of queries, certainly queries that it's never seen before. And it's amazingly flexible in its ability to provide responses that sound reasonable and sound like a person wrote the response. So you can ask it to write essays about topics. You can ask it to write code, or you can ask it to write a song, or at least lyrics for a song. And everybody's kind of blown away with how intelligent the system seems. I teach algorithms at UH Manoa, and most of the responses that it gives, it can provide code that solves most of the problems that we assign in our class. So, someone using a tool like this to just enter the questions in an exam could easily pass an exam for a lot of different classes. So this is kind of a new thing that we didn't have 2 years ago even. And it's very exciting. And a lot of people are trying to figure out how this new technology is going to impact industry and all sorts of different things. So the way this works is that it was trained on lots of data that was never available before. Wikipedia, Stack Overflow, Twitter, all of that is combined, and the information from that text is extracted into building the system. The other big advance that happened just in the last couple of months is that these text-to-image models became very good. So you can go on, these images are from Midjourney, but there's a whole bunch of other companies that just popped up to do this. You can type in, give me a technical diagram of a burrito, and it will give you a very realistic diagram. Or you can say, give me an image of a robot surfing in Hawaii, and it'll give you a handful of images, and you can pick the one you like. So anyone working in creative space, doing graphic design, is trying to figure out, okay, how do we use this new technology to speed up our business, and what does this mean for our industry? So in the sciences, the same technology is going to have a big impact. And there was a New York Times article just on Monday that talked about how all these text-to-image models, the same basic neural network, is being used to generate potential drugs and therapies in the biological sciences. So it's the same idea. Instead of generating an image, you're generating a protein or a protein target. So this is a very exciting time to be working in science and to be using these new AI tools to speed up your science. So the core technology behind all of this is our artificial neural network, or deep learning with artificial neural networks. And the basic idea is that you're approximating some function or program that maps some input X to an output Y. And that input and that output can be very flexible. The output can be a class label if you're doing supervised classification, or it can be something like an image. So this is a very flexible framework to work in. And unlike the lookup tables or programming things by hand that people used to do, the advantage of training a neural network on lots of data is that you have a very flexible program that can generalize to new inputs. So the model doesn't have to have seen that particular input before. It just has to have seen something remotely similar. So these models scale very well to big data sets. You can train these on all of Wikipedia and tons of text documents from the internet, or large image data sets, which are now available from a lot of these public sites. They're also very modular and flexible, and the reason we don't need millions and millions of images for a single neural network is that you can kind of design the neural network to take advantage of symmetries in your data. But yeah, this is the core technology, and the way I encourage people to think about them is, finding a relationship between some variable X and some variable Y. And we have these new powerful ways to model those relationships. Okay, so how do we go from a simple neural network, which takes in some variables X and outputs Y, and turn that into a chatbot? So the idea behind these language models is that we learn a neural network to perform this autoregressive task. So you give it the input is some beginning of a sentence, and we predict the next word. So here, the cat is the input X, and the next word is Y. And then after we see the next word, we can predict the next word. So if we iterate this process, we can generate an entire sentence or an entire paragraph. So one thing that quickly becomes apparent is that the predictions need to be probabilistic, because there's many possible outcomes for the next word in this sentence. So we need a way of representing probabilities in our predictions. And that's one of the key insights in the current machine learning techniques. There's not one right answer, but we need to map probabilities. And this is not a new idea, because Claude Shannon actually published a mathematical model of language back in the 1940s that was exactly this. The difference now is that we have these neural networks that can model these probabilities instead of a simple lookup table. So how do we represent uncertainty in machine learning models? The basic idea is that a neural network itself is a deterministic function. It's just some additions and multiplications. But the output of the neural network is a bunch of numbers, and we can interpret those numbers as probabilities of different events. So we can have a vector of numbers that represent probabilities. And these are the probabilities of the different categories, or in this case, the different words. Things get a little more complicated when you try to generate images, because the space of possible images is vast, right? If you think about how many different possible 1,000 pixel by 1,000 pixel color images there are, it's just an astronomical number. So a lot of machine learning is research goes into figuring out how to represent probability distribution over this very high dimensional space, and then how to learn that from lots of example images. But this is, one of the big breakthroughs in the last year is how to efficient ways of doing this. So this is an actual example. I typed in the cat in the hat eating a burrito, and it generated these images. You can think of these as samples from the space of all images of cats in hats eating burritos. And it does some pretty clever things, like, this burrito here is striped like the colors of the cat in the hat. So this is one way of representing a probability distribution over high dimensional data. This is a little technical, but I just want to give people a sense of how these things work. So if you follow the same technique as what we do with language, then each pixel is a word, and we can take a sequence of pixels and try to predict the next pixel in the image. So the input are all these blue pixels, and the output is this red pixel. And we can repeat that process for every pixel in the image. And that gives us a generating process to generate an image. So you can train the model to do this, a single neural network model. And then you can take an image of a person swimming, like this blurry low dimensional image, or it's a 32 by 32 image. You can cut off the bottom half of the image, and then you can generate possible completions of the image using this autoregressive pixel by pixel technique. So these images kind of make sense. You're at least keeping the water theme. But this is a very slow process, and so it's this never really took off for images, even though we use the same technique for natural language. So the method that's used by these new image to or text to image models is called a diffusion model, where we take some noisy image, and then we repeatedly apply this what's called a denoising autoencoder model to predict how to make this image more realistic, starting from the noise. And generating training data for these models is pretty simple. You just take an image, a real image, and then you add noise to it and have the model try and predict the original image from that noised image. So this is a very simple idea, but it only recently caught on because people figured out some tricks to make it work. And I think it's much closer to the way in which your brain probably generates images. So if I say, imagine a dog riding a bicycle, you can probably conjure up some dreamlike image of that scene. And your brain probably isn't filling in pixel by pixel. It's probably doing something more like this, where you get the vague outline of the scene, and then you kind of fill in the details iteratively. So I think the big takeaways for what's going on in machine learning, and therefore AI, is that we have these very powerful tools for modeling relationships between variables. These variables can be very high dimensional, like images or sequences. And these relationships can be probabilistic. So we can represent these very high dimensional probabilities. And I think a lot of people miss this if they just look at the classification tasks that an intro to machine learning course describes. So neural networks are the flexible models that we're able to do this with. And they require lots of data to learn. But as I'll mention, there's some techniques that we can use to speed up the process, even if we don't have tons of data. So a big question is, what can AI do for science? This is a question that I'm very interested in. But these things are very closely related, because science is all about modeling the relationships between variables, the variables being our observations of the world. And many of the relationships that we care about might be too complex for humans to discover. So maybe we've discovered all the easy relationships, like F equals ma, and we have a lot of hard relationships that are still to be discovered, but it's difficult for people to do that on their own. So having these AI tools might help us a lot. And one quote that comes up a lot is, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I really like this quote, because when you train a machine learning model, people like to point out the flaws of that model. It doesn't work everywhere. It only works for certain applications. But that's exactly what we do in science too. We have these models that work for particular applications, but don't necessarily generalize to situations like in general relativity. So F equals ma only works in some areas of physics, but it doesn't apply everywhere. So I view artificial intelligence and machine learning in particular as a way of automate this model building for accelerating scientific discoveries. And there are many different ways to do that. I also like to point out that Gauss, this famous mathematician, he invented linear regression to study the orbit of series. And linear regression is just the first neural network. And now it's, the workhorse of science and industry, and all, pretty much any scientist has used linear regression to model some data at some point. So linear regression is a simple neural network. The modern neural networks of today are much bigger and more powerful, and can deal with more complicated data. Okay, so that's kind of my overview of today's artificial intelligence technologies. And what I want to give a sense of is 4 different types of applications of these technologies. So the supervised learning is what most people are familiar with. That's kind of the basic machine learning approach of predicting missing data from known data. But there's also these other areas, simulation-based inference, where you're combining known physics with machine learning, and dimensionality reduction, which I guess people are very familiar with that if you've ever used PCA or used these visualization tools. And then active learning covers robots and anything where you have some agent interacting with the environment and making sequential decisions about data. So first of all, supervised learning covers the case where we want to predict the future. So scientists collect lots of data about the world. Some values are often missing. For example, any data that's in the future we don't have access to. So we can build machine learning models to predict missing observations. An example of this is the time series prediction of CO2 at the Mauna Loa Observatory. This is a famous graph of our first indication that CO2 levels were rising. These measurements were taking at the NOAA Mauna Loa Observatory. And so you have this oscillation with the seasons, but it's a very clear curve. And this is how, our first knowledge of that CO2 levels were rising. So you can train a machine learning model on the historical data to learn this pattern. And then you can forecast future years, what the CO2 levels should be. So another example, if you take that idea and scale it up to high dimensional data, you can do all sorts of things. So this is a project I have with Professor Karam Paradu in the Atmospheric Sciences Department, and our student Michael. You can take historical weather data, it's called reanalysis data, and you can learn to predict tropical cyclones from all the other variables that you have access to. So you train this model on 60 years of historical data, and then you can use it to understand the relationship between what variables create the conditions that lead to tropical cyclones. So this is with a big convolution neural network where the input are these atmospheric variables, and then the output is, in the future, what is the probability of a tropical cyclone being generated? If you do the same thing with very short-term satellite data, we can do predictions of cloud cover. So this is a project I have with Giuseppe Torri in Atmospheric Sciences. We take this high resolution satellite data, 500-meter resolution every 10 minutes, and we can predict 10, 20, 30 minutes in advance where the clouds are going to be over the island of Oahu. So the reason for doing this is that Oahu has a lot of solar power generation, and if a cloud goes over the city, the power company HECO sees a huge spike in energy demand. And so we're trying to use this technology to reduce the uncertainty of these renewable energy methods. Another example is super resolution. So if you have a low resolution image and you want to generate a high resolution image, you can learn the properties of that high resolution image from machine learning models. And this has tons of applications, from data compression. So like the JPEG file format is an example where you have a compressed image that can be turned into a larger image. Photo enhancement, microscopy, medical imaging, astronomy, climate, weather, tons of applications. So one of the things we're doing with the satellite data is taking the low resolution weather forecasts. The government produces these forecasts 14 days out, but they're very coarse resolution. So they don't account for the mountains over Oahu. And so what we can do is we can take that coarse resolution forecast and give a prediction of what the clouds will actually look like at very high resolution, using satellite data, the patterns in the satellite data to capture that information. So this is the exact same type of model that's being used to generate pictures of dogs riding bicycles. We can use that for this science application. With the Cancer Center, we're doing things like taking a body scan of a person and predicting the body composition that looks like X-rays. So on the top here is the actual X-ray of a person, and on the bottom here is an AI generated image that's supposed to represent the X-ray image that we would expect given a person's body shape. And the application, we had funding from NASA to do this for astronauts because you can't bring an X-ray up to the International Space Station, but you can do these 3D body scans. And NASA is very interested in protecting the astronauts by detecting when they have low bone density and they're at risk of not being healthy. In the area of microscopy, I really like this image cartoon from a Nature review article pointing out the promises and risks of using AI for high resolution microscopy. So if you have a microscope that has low resolution, you might get a picture of a cell that looks like this. This, of course, is a cartoon. And you can use AI to clean up the image to give you this very high resolution stuff. But the problem is because the model is trained on a subset of data that it knows, you can give it some other image like this, and it will produce a cat-shaped cell, right? So you have to be very careful with how you use these technologies. You have to understand, the probabilistic bias of these models if you're going to use them. And it doesn't make sense for certain applications. So I had to take this image here and feed it into Midjourney to see what it would produce. And of course, this Midjourney system was not trained on microscopy images. It was trained on artwork and stuff, but it did a pretty good job of producing a cool image. And then if you go even further, you end up with things like this. Okay, so that kind of covers some of the obvious applications of machine learning to science. I want to talk about another application which is not so obvious, and that is how do we combine existing computational models with these new machine learning techniques. And this is something I did my PhD on, working in high energy physics. And I think it's pretty cool, and it informs a lot of the research I do now with astronomers and physicists. So the idea is, instead of training on real data, we can actually take simulation data that scientists are already producing and use that to train artificial intelligence models. So a lot of different scientists use physics models of the world to simulate very complex processes. And then the outcomes of the simulations are compared to observations to test hypotheses about the world. So this kind of encompasses what are known as inverse problems, where we're trying to predict something about the world theta from observable measurements X. And the only thing we have to connect these two is some knowledge of the physics of how the data is produced from the input parameters theta. So here's a trivial example of how this works. If you have, say you receive a negative COVID test, but you don't actually know whether you're actually negative or maybe it was a false negative on the test. Maybe the test was bad. So in this situation, theta would be the hidden knowledge that you care about. That's whether you're infected or not. This intermediate step, Z, is whether the test was accurate. And X is the data you have, whether the test was positive. So typically scientists would use Bayes' rule to calculate this. If you've taken any statistics or probability class, you usually you run into this for medical diagnosis because it's a classic problem. And that relates the probability that you're infected with the data you observe, and you can flip it around in terms of the probability that you get a positive test given that you're infected. So this flipping of the probability is the key usefulness of Bayes' rule. So now let's scale up that basic idea to one of the biggest science experiments of our time. This is the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, Switzerland. So the scale is enormous. It's the size of a football field. Here's a man standing down below. This is all underground. And this is a detector where they collide protons together to see what comes out. So this is probing the fundamental particles of the universe. But we can frame it in the same way. You know, instead of whether or not we have COVID, the question is whether or not we have a new fundamental particle, such as the Higgs boson or dark matter. The process, instead of a COVID test, we run these giant experiments in the detector where you collide protons and they create all these decay products, which are detected by different elements here. And then eventually we have these detector measurements, which we then, this is the only thing we're able to observe after all this work. So the problem we have is that typically you would calculate in science the probability of X, the observed values, given theta, whether or not you had a particle. But even though we understand how this detector works, the actual computations required to compute this probability is too difficult. It's computationally intractable. So we need a new approach to, we either need to approximate this hard integral or we need a new approach. And machine learning actually offers an interesting alternative approach, which is what I studied for my PhD. So this idea of simulation-based inference is that we can run simulations of different possible worlds. So we have maybe an event created by a Higgs boson or maybe some other background event. We can simulate what that looks like in the detector. And then we can train a machine learning classifier to tell us which event caused that, or which event caused that data to be produced. So instead of using Bayes' rule, we're actually just approximating the alternative function p theta given x instead of px given theta. And then so last year, my colleagues and I actually wrote a book on how this new way of doing science is actually being used throughout high energy physics now. Oops, sorry. So it turns out this is a very, very useful tool throughout any science where you have a lot of good physical models. So astronomy is another example. This is some work by Professor Jennifer Van Saders at the IFA and her student Zach Claytor. They built this simulation system of stellar rotation, which includes lots of star spots, and they use their understanding of physics and observation to create what the light curves look like that we observe. So a light curve is just a measurement of the amount of light coming from a star over time. So it's this nice time series curve. And the idea is we can take these light curves and predict how fast the star is rotating from that curve. So Zach has a very nice paper showing that this works really well for estimating the rotation of stars. I also have a collaboration with Professor Judong Sun over on Maui, where we're taking observations from the new Daniel K. Inouye Solar Telescope and predicting the atmosphere of the sun in 3D and all these solar state variables from the polarized light that we observe at the telescope. So again, this is the same idea. We run these simulations, we train an AI model on the simulated data, and then we apply that model to real data coming from the telescope. Okay, so the third topic I wanted to touch on is this idea of dimensionality reduction. And I think this is really appealing to anyone who is not familiar with machine learning. Being able to visualize the results is really important. And I think it has a ton of applications. This is actually what kind of drew me to machine learning in the first place. So if you have really complex high dimensional data, it's very difficult to work with, and you don't have a good intuition for what's going on. But if you're able to reduce the dimensionality of the data and plot it in a nice visual space, you can use the visual processing part of your brain to help make sense of it. And that's often very helpful for data exploration when doing science. It's also useful to do dimensionality reduction for data compression and for extracting features that help you do modeling and downstream analysis. So this is this example here is from Facebook or Meta. They took hundreds of thousands of metagenomic sequences. So these are sequences of proteins that were found in the environment, not human genes, but just the bacteria that grow on your desk. And they took these sequences, they created a 2D visualization of the space, and they also predicted the protein structure of all these sequences. So this is a huge map of the proteins that surround us every day that, they're not explored well. It's considered the dark matter of biology. Another example that students might be familiar with is academic texts. So this is a map produced of all the well-known texts and books that are used in academia. So somebody extracted information about what texts were used for which classes. And so you have a similarity metric between texts, and then you produce this giant two-dimensional visualization where similar texts are close to each other. So over here we have physics, astronomy, math, chemistry, computer sciences down here. Interestingly enough, computer science is close to political science. I think this is math over here. Oh, engineering is in red here. So one of the powerful things about deep learning is that we can really supercharge this dimensionality reduction, because basically what deep learning is doing is learning new representations of data that we can do visualizations with, or this feature extraction, all in an automated way. So a deep neural network, takes in some image, and if you train it to do classification, what it learns are new representations of the original high dimensional data that can then be used for that classification task. So a typical computer vision neural network will learn features which detect edges and textures, and then the higher part of the network, it'll detect more complicated shapes. So you can take any layer of a neural network and use that as a new representation of your data. And you can do, if you reduce it to 2D, you can get these visualizations of what all your data examples look like in that new representation. So when you reduce it to 2D, you're trying to put similar examples close to each other. So in this layer of the network, a French loaf looks similar to an orange or a burrito. But in another layer of the network that focuses more on texture or edges, you might have a different visualization here. So one of the really powerful things that you can do with this is you can reuse these representations for different machine learning tasks. So I would say, 95% of artificial intelligence applications and systems today are not models trained on their own giant data set. What people do is they take a computer vision model trained by Google or Meta, they download that model, and then they chop off the top part of it and then train a smaller model on top. So this is an example of taking a model trained on cats and dogs and cars and trucks. We removed the top layers of the network, and then we use this for breast cancer screening, where we pass in mammograms into the input of the model. This part of the model just detects the textures and the shapes in that image. And then we use that representation to distinguish between cancer, no cancer. So this is, most people wanting to use machine learning in their projects don't have millions of examples to train their system on. So what they do is they reuse models that were trained for similar tasks. And this works really well. A simple example of this that we use this technique for a project with Masato, who's in the biology department. Vanya is a grad student. They recorded hundreds of hours of video of these cave fish that they're studying, and they want to know how the cave fish are interacting with this vibrating rod in the center of the petri dish. So it's very time consuming to manually go through these videos and label the behavior of the fish. But what Nick was able to do is take these videos, label 100 examples of where the fish is, the head and the tail, and then train one of these pre-trained models from the internet. And now he has this great system where you can just feed the video into the model and it will tell you exactly where the fish is. And so you can automate a lot of this analysis that previously people were doing by hand. Similarly, we have a project to analyze microbiome data where we have this very high dimensional microbe abundance data from metagenomics. And we can train these neural networks on different tasks to reduce the dimensionality and get nice images like this one here on the right, where you can see clear clusters of where the sample came from. So, all of these samples were from tundra, all these samples were from the ocean, etc. So the final application I want to talk about is active learning. And this is the idea that you can have a machine learning system interact with the scientific process in such a way that you train a machine learning model on some experimental data. The machine learning model suggests what experiments to do next. And then you do those experiments and that informs the next iteration of the machine learning model. So it's this feedback loop to accelerate science. So I've done a couple projects in this area. The first, during my PhD, I worked on computational chemistry, where we want to predict what reactions would take place between different molecules. And so we had these really expensive computational experiments where we would simulate the quantum mechanics of two molecules to predict the reaction energies of those molecules. But they were so expensive that we couldn't do all molecules that we had. So what we did was we used a machine learning model to prioritize which ones were the most interesting. We would run those experiments, and then using the data that was generated, we would train a new iteration of the machine learning model. So this is actually a very common paradigm now for drug discovery, where you use the machine learning models to speed up and prioritize experiments to do, because the experiments are so expensive. Another area where we use this is actually for machine learning. Whenever you want to train a machine learning model, you usually have to do a lot of expensive experiments to find the best architecture for your neural network. And so we use machine learning models to decide which types of machine learning we should use. And I actually have an open source project called Sherpa that helps you do this and automate this. So just at a high level, one of the techniques that we use for active learning is called Bayesian optimization, where this is a one-dimensional case where we have you have to choose which x's to try next, and you tend to choose what experiments to do based on your uncertainty of what the model is. So you model the relationship between the x and the y, and these areas you're very uncertain. So you do experiments in this area in order to reduce that uncertainty. And so there's it provides a nice theoretical framework for deciding what experiment to do next. And my favorite example of this is this great paper by Google, where they actually used these very complex techniques to optimize a cookie recipe. And the experiments they did were actually baking cookies in the Google cafeteria. And then they had people report how much they liked the cookies. But I think this is important for any scientist to be aware of, because scientists do this sort of stuff all the time, these like iterative experiments. And so this is kind of a very nice framework for thinking about that process. So in conclusion, I think this is a very exciting time for science, because we have all these new AI tools, which are very powerful. And here I've kind of touched on what I see as 4 different scenarios. And you can kind of think about them as, what data do you have? So if you have lots of data where you have inputs and outputs, you can do supervised learning. But most people don't have that. So the other alternatives that people are using are simulation-based inference, where if you have a simulator of some physical process, you can kind of combine that with machine learning in interesting ways. Or you can use these dimensionality reduction techniques or transfer learning to get a better handle on your what features are important in your data. And then finally, active learning is, it's very much related to robotics and reinforcement learning and all these. It's a much higher level, complicated process, but that's definitely an area that's exciting. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was really fascinating, especially to see how fast this field is moving. I've been watching some of this coming out recently in the news too, and it's amazing how far this field is going and how quickly We're open for questions now, so anyone feel free to either type your question into the chat function, or you can just unmute your microphone and ask Peter directly.
Okay, I'll go first. Hi, Peter. This is Rob Jedicke. Great talk. Really interesting. Many decades ago, probably back when you were in elementary school, I read an article about some people who were doing early machine learning with an FPGA, where it was so expensive to get an FPGA at that time that they could only afford one. So they trained it to do something. And then they took what their final result was, they put it into another FPGA and it didn't work. And what they figured was that it was actually taking advantage of some sort of quantum mechanical connections between the bits that were not designed into the FPGA. So I'm just wondering if you took exactly the same, process that you've got that they developed now for ChatGPT and put it into another computer that's otherwise designed exactly the same, will it reproduce the same results?
That's a deep question. There's a lot of possible answers there. To first order, people are downloading these computer vision models and reusing them for all sorts of things. So, in that sense, 99% of the time, things are working well. The code is reproducible to that extent. There are some weird things going on that there's lots of approximations that take place in like the numerical precision is actually really low in a lot of the things that people are doing, just because they're squeezing out the best performance possible. And so in that sense, sometimes the numerical precision is an issue. So it's hard to reproduce things. But in general, people are sharing code and models, and that works fine. I'm not sure about FPGAs. I'm not super familiar with those technologies, but.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So Carol had written into the chat, can you tell us a little bit more about what kinds of computers are used for these applications? Yeah,
so to do deep learning, you really want a GPU because it's 10 to 20 times faster. One of the reasons why this is happening now is because all the computer gamers were buying graphics processing units for their games. And so the computer game industry gave rise to the GPU industry, and the GPU industry the GPUs are really useful for fast matrix multiplication. And all the computations here are fast matrix multiplies. So that was a big driver of this, the advancement of AI in the last 10 years, because a lot of these ideas were around previously, but we just didn't have the computation to make them work.
Peter, I've been sort of fascinated and simultaneously disturbed, probably like a lot of faculty, about ChatGPT and looking at what this might mean for students taking classes at the university. What are your predictions as a faculty member and how we're going to be dealing with this over the next year or two?
I think it's good that it didn't happen before COVID, because I would say no more online exams. And yeah, it certainly makes you think about what kinds of questions you put in your assignments and stuff. And what we expect from students, because one view is that ChatGPT is really good at regurgitating text from Wikipedia because it was trained on Wikipedia. But if you want your students to learn to be really creative, then how do you get at that? You want them to give answers that are somewhat unique from what ChatGPT would give. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting questions that are raised by this, and I'm excited to see how it's going to play out.
Cheryl has a question in the chat. Will AI be able to recognize the unusual anomalies that lead to serendipitous discoveries?
Yeah, so I think this is actually really the latest techniques are going to be really important for that. So one of the things you can do with these models is anomaly detection. Because when you build a probabilistic model of your data, you can then use that to say, okay, this event is low probability, it's an anomaly. And then you can focus on that and try to understand what was happening at that event. And, you know, machine learning has always had trouble modeling high dimensional distributions in a flexible way. And these image generating models, I think that's a very exciting step forward in being able to do that. Because you're modeling and learning this distribution over very high dimensional space, and you can apply that technique to a lot of different problems in science.
Very good. Thank you, Peter. Are there any final questions? Okay, well, if not, I'd like to thank you very much, Peter. That was a really fascinating talk. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I hope to see
Thank you.
everybody soon. Our next event is going to be held Wednesday, February 8th at 2 p.m. Hawaiian time. It's going to feature Dr. Amy Moran. She's a faculty member in the School of Life Sciences here in CNS. And her work focuses on the physiological ecology and evolution of marine invertebrates. So please watch your inboxes for your invitations to that event. Have a wonderful rest of your day or your evening. Thanks again so much for joining us today. Aloha.